Hello and welcome to the final seminar of the Earth, Water, Fire seminar series. Today's discussion is about world leadership for conservation. This seminar series has been organized by the 2020 Wyss Scholars from Lewis and Clark Law School, Northern Arizona University, Yale School of the Environment, and Yale Law School, with support from the Wyss Foundation. The series has included 3 other seminars, which focused on a range of conservation issues uniquely important in the Western United States. Together, these seminars highlight concepts that support good policymaking in light of the new administration and shifting conservation priorities. We would like to thank the Wyss Foundation for making the seminar series possible, and to our expert panelists that will be speaking today. We are also thankful for our university faculty advisors and Caitlin Powers from the Wyss Foundation for the organization's support and for Caitlin's help connecting us to the panelists featured today. Today's panel is World Leadership for Conservation, the 30 by 30 campaign. This panel will discuss global campaigns that are calling on world leaders to commit to a science-driven, ambitious New Deal for nature. We will explore opportunities to expand the capacity of communities, indigenous peoples, and nations to conserve lands, waters, and wildlife to safeguard the natural world upon which we all depend. This topic is especially fitting as President Biden is expected to sign or has signed an omnibus climate order today to elevate climate change as a national security priority. Actions like this will help us shift our focus to conservation strategies to enact change. We will explore what it looks like to put sweeping conservation changes like this one into practice. As we discuss land conservation today, we also would like to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples around the world who are the original stewards of all lands. Indigenous people remain vested caretakers of these special places, and we bring this history and knowledge into our work as conservationists and into the discussion today. We'd like to get started with the panel. My name is Ella Samuel, and I'm a Master of Environmental Science and Policy candidate at Northern Arizona University. My work centers on strengthening our understanding of ecological restoration practices in the Southwest, while also investigating the interaction between policy and management in the restoration context. I am moderating today's discussion along with Katie Pofall.
Hi, I'm Katie Pofall. I'm a second-year Master of Environmental Management candidate at the Yale School of the Environment. I focus on land conservation and in particular the ways that conservation organizations can work more effectively with communities to achieve lasting solutions. Now, we'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves briefly for 1 or 2 minutes. We'll get the chance to hear more about their experiences in depth later in this seminar. So we'll get started here and hear from Beau Kiklis, the Conservation Colorado Public Lands Advocate, just for a minute or 2 as he introduces himself.
Great, thanks Ella, and thanks Katie. Great to be here with everyone today. As Katie mentioned, my name is Beau. I'm the Public Lands Advocate for Conservation Colorado, based in Denver. Zooming in today on the ancestral and sacred lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples land. For those not familiar with Conservation Colorado, we're the state's largest environmental advocacy organization. We have an office in Denver as our headquarters, but also have field offices in Pueblo, Carbondale, Grand Junction, and Durango. We are working to protect Colorado's air, land, water, and people through grassroots organizing, advocacy, and a robust electoral and elections program. First came to Conservation Colorado in 2017 as a grassroots organizer, moved into a role after that running our Outdoor Business Alliance program, and have been in this role as the Public Lands Advocate for about the last 1.5 years now. So thanks everyone, and I think I'll turn it over to Katie next.
As there are 2 Katies, I'll introduce myself as Katie Christensen, and as the other Katie shared, I'm the Director of Conservation Strategy at the WILD Foundation. For those unfamiliar with WILD, we're based here in Boulder, Colorado, and we've been working around the world on protecting and restoring at least half of Earth's wild nature for the last 40 years. So here at WILD, I lead our Restoring the Rockies initiative, which is a coalition within our Nature Needs Half movement. And we established this coalition to connect and align a regional coalition of decision makers here in the West towards this urgent conservation policy as called for by scientists around protection of half of our ecosystems. My own background is as an interdisciplinary conservationist, and my work in that realm has ranged, including work in science and policy, industry, education, outreach, storytelling, and the arts. And I'm actually an artist. I am artist in residence at the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, which is based in Jackson, Wyoming. And I create artwork for interpretive panels and interpretive resources at protected areas. I have a book coming out this spring, The Artist's Field Guide to Yellowstone, for which I worked and collaborated with 50 artists and writers throughout the greater Yellowstone region to put this project together. I share the other Katie's alma mater of the Yale School of the Environment, and while I was there, I was also a Wyss Conservation Scholar. I'm really excited for the conversation today. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Now we'll hear from Tracy Stone Manning, Associate Vice President for Public Lands at the National Wildlife Foundation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy. I'm quite pleased to be with everyone today. I very much look forward to the day when we'll be in a room with 108 people instead of on a flat screen, but this will have to do. As Katie mentioned, I work with the National Wildlife Federation. We're one of the nation's largest conservation organizations, been around for over 80 years, uniting people around wildlife. I run our public lands program, and I've done so for the last 3 years. And we were just chatting at the start, before this call started, about what a breath of fresh air it is to be talking about doing work for the environment instead of only defending the environment, which we've spent the last 3 years doing. So it's a delightful page to turn. I've spent my career in conservation and public service. Before coming to National Wildlife Federation, I was the Chief of Staff to Governor Steve Bullock up here in Montana. And before that, ran the Department of Environmental Quality as a member of his cabinet. And then before that was got to work with my very favorite farmer in the United States Senate, Senator John Tester. I worked for him in his first term doing natural resource policy and in-state work for him. And I came to that public service decade from conservation. Ran an organization here in Missoula called Clark Fork Coalition, where at the time we successfully advocated in a very difficult conservative time to remove a dam at the confluence of the Blackfoot and Clark Fork rivers. A giant and beautiful restoration project that will continue to keep giving to us for years and years to come.
Thanks, Tracy. Great to hear about that. And finally, but not the least, we'll hear from Aaron, who's got the best microphone in the room for sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Wyss. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Western Priorities. We are a public lands advocacy and watchdog group focused on primarily Mountain West states. And as Tracy mentioned, it is a breath of fresh air right now, especially on a day when President Biden just signed an executive order making 30 by 30 an official goal for the nation. Before that, we did spend a great deal of time holding the Trump administration accountable. Before that, we were encouraging the Obama administration to do the right thing at places like Bears Ears. So it is a pleasure to be here today. My own story: before I became a public lands advocate, I spent 14 years in journalism, mostly in the West. I'm a native of Tucson, Arizona, and worked in Portland and here in the Denver area where I am today. And now continuing that work as an advocate, hence the microphone. I do host a podcast for Center for Western Priorities called The Landscape, where we talk about 30 by 30 and a great deal more.
Thanks, Aaron. And so nice to get to know all of you a bit better. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on some of our questions. So our panelists today will have a chance to speak on the issues that are important to them. And our participants here today are encouraged to add your questions via the question and answer function, which is in the toolbar below. And we may incorporate some of those audience questions throughout our discussion. But first, we're going to kick off with 4 questions that will be open to 2 panelists each, and then 1 final question that's for the entire panel. And so just wanted to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for being here today. And we're just really excited for this discussion. So the first thing we wanted to do is just understand the nature of these campaigns a little bit better. And this is a question particularly for Erin and Katie. Could you tell us a bit more about the 30 by 30 campaign and Nature Needs Half? What does it mean to protect 30 to 50% of lands and oceans? And what kind of actions will be strengthened and what might be curtailed?
I'm happy to dive in there first, I guess. The problem, and this is one that has been identified by scientists, and it's important to stress that this is a science-driven campaign and letting the science drive the policy here. The problem is that America, the continental US, is losing a football field's worth of nature every 30 seconds. And across the globe, human activity has significantly altered 3/4 of the land, 2/3 of the ocean. And at this current rate that we're proceeding, by the middle of this century, less than 10% of the Earth will be free from human impact. And that is having a disastrous effect both on the climate and on ecosystems around the world. And so the only way forward, and this is building on the work of scientists like Dr. Enrique Sala, Eric Dinerstein, the only way forward is to very quickly protect 30% of the world's land and oceans by the end of the decade, and then make it to 50% by the middle of the century, or we are staring down, and we are currently in the middle of the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history. And I'll let Katie take it from there.
Sure. So I'm here representing the Nature Needs Half movement. So I'm going to answer Katie's question specifically around what it means to protect half of Earth's lands and oceans. And what it means is that we have a chance of a future. It means that we have a chance of a sustainable planet. Scientists agree, as we just heard from Erin on, that we need to protect nature at this scale and really specifically at half to continue to receive the life-sustaining ecosystem services that we all benefit from and that right now we all receive for free. And we know that we need to get there as quickly as possible because once a landscape is destroyed, it's gone. And that's not to say that restoration isn't possible, which I believe we'll have the opportunity to speak to soon, but restoration is expensive. And sometimes in the case of an extinct species, restoration isn't possible. So moving quickly towards these large scale protection goals is efficient, and it's also best for humanity and for biodiversity. For a moment, I want to speak to feasibility, and we think about cost. We think about how can is it economically feasible to protect land at this scale? And what we really need to do is shift that question to the economic feasibility of not protecting land at this scale. Is it economically feasible to not protect half of the Earth? And as I mentioned, we're receiving life-sustaining ecosystem services for free. And without protecting half, we lose ecosystem function, and therefore we lose ecosystem services such as climate stabilization and the contributions to our human health needs that are what are keeping us alive: clean air, clean water, pollination. So if we need to come up with solutions to these services outside of the ecosystems that are giving them to us right now, those are going to cost a lot of money. To put some numbers to this feasibility question, we estimate that to get the ball rolling on the protection of half of the planet will cost $20 billion. At the same time, it's costing us nearly $20 trillion to deal with the pandemic, which, as we know, is a result of our tattered wildlands and misaligned relationship with nature. So we're really actually working to secure a future while that is still feasible to secure this future and to do it at the scale as called for by scientists.
Thank you, Katie and Erin. And actually, Katie, you touched on a follow-up question I wanted to understand a bit better. how do we get to scale? Like, can you speak to that concept? I think for a lot of folks, it's hard to grasp that level of protection. And I know Biden in the omnibus bill has specified some language around that. And just wanted to hear a bit more about how we get to that. And if you could highlight a couple of strategies.
Sure. So scale, of course, is the central theme to both of what Erin and I are talking about today and the rest of the panelists. And we determine scale based on what science is called for, 50% protection. We are working towards 50% protection through public outreach and through movement building, because we recognize that to get to something at this scale requires a shift in culture. And a note about culture, and just a stat to kind of put us in this mindset. Here in the US, 20% of our population is scientifically literate, and 49% believe that climate change is man-made. Compare that to the EU, where only 20% of the population is scientifically literate, and yet 58% of EU residents believe that climate change is man-made. So culture and the stories that we tell really are central to us moving past the challenges in these questions of scale. And what Nature Needs Half is trying to do is to build new understandings of ourselves and of nature. And here in the Rockies, we're trying to do that through this coalition called Restoring the Rockies, where we're experiencing a situation in the West where only 12% of our lands are under permanent protection. And those are the places that we're relying on for these climate stabilization and human health needs. So Restoring the Rockies is how we're getting to scale here, and it plugs into our global movement by coordinating at regional levels and empowering members to work within their own spheres of influence to ultimately protect 50% of lands by building community, by writing new stories, by creating collective action, and doing that in line with our scientific understandings of what nature needs and therefore what people need.
And if I can just add on the public knowledge and opinion, Colorado College every year has its Conservation in the West poll, which is considered the gold standard for public opinion polling in the West across all the Mountain West states. They asked about the 30 by 30 goal last year, and 73% of Westerners say they support the goal of protecting 30% of America's land and oceans by the end of the decade. So the public opinion is already there. It is broad bipartisan support. It is not something where you see a traditional Democratic-Republican divide in terms of support for the goal. So the support is there, and the next step is, how do you do that? And that's where all of these various tools in the toolkit, it's going to have to be national public land, which includes national monuments, national parks, national conservation lands, fish and wildlife refuges, along with state lands, state parks, state protected areas, and of course, private land. And the role, I'm sure we'll get into this, the role that private landowners will play in guaranteeing these lands are protected. It's a very big deal, and it's encouraging to see these kinds of collaborative partnerships with landowners to make sure that they're going to be part of this 30 by 30 solution over the next 10 years, and then getting to 50% beyond that.
Thanks, Erin and Katie. And I think that actually tees up our next question really well. We want to discuss sort of aspects of these campaigns, in particular, collaborative conservation. And I think you've highlighted the important aspect that, this isn't just about science, this is also about people and culture. And so we want to address the interactions between different stakeholders. And so this is a question for Beau and Katie, but of course, Tracy and Erin, if you have some thoughts, feel free to jump in. So the 30 by 30 and Nature Needs Half campaigns are two global land conservation campaigns, but how do these campaigns reinforce messages about the importance of collaboration? And indeed, how can these campaigns better collaborate among one another and encourage collaboration among NGOs, policymakers, and, as Erin highlights, landowners and frontline communities?
Yeah, happy to jump in there. And I mean, I guess I want to go back to a point that Katie made around movement building, right? And I think that's one of the big commonalities between 30 by 30 and Nature Needs Half, right? These are big, bold initiatives, but those big, bold initiatives need people to be able to advance them, right? Um, Ultimately, I think what we know after the amount of years that people have been working in conservation and advocacy is that the best solutions are the ones that come from the ground up or that are informed by people, right? Protecting and conserving lands and doing that through the lens of science and biodiversity. We absolutely need to do that. It's what the science says we need to do. It's what the climate science says we have to do. But if we're only looking at opportunities through those lens, then we risk doing harm to communities and people along the way that are reliant on those lands, right? So again, I go back to this real need for movement building, and really comes down to the will of the people. I mean, are we building this movement to demand action from decision makers? Today was a big day for the 30 by 30 movement. I think also for Nature Needs Happen that President Biden took a significant action declaring this new 30 by 30 goal, amongst other things, including putting a pause on fossil fuel leasing to take a hard look at how we do leasing and permitting on our public lands. But what does that mean for other decision makers, right? What are we asking our senators, our Congress people? What do we want governors to be working on, county commissioners, right? This is an opportunity to look holistically, right? I think, Aaron, you were hitting on this as well, right? That we're looking at state opportunities to protect lands at the state level, private lands, not just big federal public lands as well. So organizing out west, right, and lobbying back in DC or lobbying at our state capitals, I think is kind of the tried and true that I think of. But regardless, continue to support that with concerted communications efforts, getting studies and films out there, telling the story of these places, the story of these people. Really, we just have to get out there and campaign. That's what this work's about.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that, I would just say that this is a planetary problem, and therefore we need planetary solutions to address this problem. So what I know 30 by 30 and definitely Nature Needs Half are doing are connecting these movements to global initiatives. Nature Needs Half was founded in 2009 by the Wild Foundation at the 9th World Wilderness Congress in Mexico. And its steering committee today is composed of world leaders working together to formalize what is a global plan for half. So here in the West and through this Western arm of Nature Needs Half, we have the opportunity to not only advance the conservation policy here in our backyards that scientists are calling for, but to also collaborate with these international colleagues and Nature Needs Half members around the world on this global plan. And restoring the Rockies, we're approaching it with urgency. And that urgency is twofold. First, we're losing our Western landscapes at an alarming rate. And Aaron brought up some great stats on that, and I'll share a couple more. To the football field example, here in the West specifically, we're losing one football field's worth of natural area every 2.5 minutes. So that's just looking at this area specifically. And I did some quick math during this 60-minute webinar. That means 32 acres are gone in the West. And that by the end of the day, we'll have lost 800 acres here in the West. That's just what we're talking about here. Again, this is a planetary problem. And so moving on to what that means and how we can plug our work in the West into this global initiative is that occurring in September is the World Conservation Congress, where global leaders will convene to decide on conservation policy agendas regarding how much nature people need to survive. And what our hope is that this work that we're doing in coalition building in the Rockies can serve as an example of one region mobilizing in defense for Earth's biosphere and people's livelihoods, and demonstrating that protection at this scale, at half, is possible, and two, to show what framework we can use to build community and collective action. And so, and again, a feasibility question, which I think is part of, Katie, what you were bringing up here, is, do we use technological solutions to address these challenges? I think conservation tends to go there. What we're trying to do is to bring coordination and collaboration and specifically using coalitions to this, because this seems to be where a lot of movements fail. And the reason we're investing in coalitions is that coalitions build community, and it's within community that we practice and shape culture. So we're hoping that, and we believe that by investing in community at this level of bringing together people through shared values and giving specific opportunities to plug their work into this global roadmap, people and members simultaneously can work within their own spheres of influence and collaborate with international partners on this planetary goal.
Thank you, Beau and Katie. And that actually really covered a question we had about global collaboration as well. And so now I'd like to turn to Tracy. We have a question. We'd like to understand it's a question more about priority setting. And I think with your experience in policymaking, I'd like to understand, how do these strategies tie into, first, how do they tie into restoration initiatives, like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration? And how do we balance conservation and restoration strategies looking forward, knowing that sometimes we have to make hard choices and trade-offs?
Yeah, I fall in the hashtag all of the things camp. We need all of the things. But before I answer that question, I just want to pause for a second and reflect on the fact that the President of the United States today asked us all to reach for this incredibly big, bold, beautiful goal of protecting 30% or conserving 30% of our land and ocean by 2030. And we've never had a president ask us to rise to such a level of conservation. It's astounding. And doing so a week into his presidency, I think should send the signal that there, as Katie was talking about, there is real urgency, right? It is truly an urgent time. We are in the 6th mass extinction. We are in a wildlife crisis. Scientists tell us we'll lose a third of our wildlife populations if we do nothing. We're obviously in a climate crisis. And all of that is, makes people want to hit the leave button, the red leave button. But all of it also provides, I think, really great hope. And that gets to the restoration components of it. If you think about it, we are in these crises today. So simply, and it's not so simple, but simply protecting lands into the future will not be enough. It will be what protecting lands will do would stop the further depredation of wildlife numbers, but it doesn't reverse them. And we need to reverse them. We need to leave this place better off than we found it. And the way you reverse it is through restoration. And there are, the good thing about restoration is, especially right now, is it solves yet another crisis in our country, which is an economic crisis brought on by the pandemic. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out of work. And there are jobs to be had on our landscapes, restoring them. And not only will it help wildlife, but it will also get at those ecosystem services that Katie was talking about. A third of human food is pollinated by wild pollinators. And economists say it's about a $6 billion value, 6 billion with a B. And that has no technological replacement, right? So we need to make sure that there's habitat for pollinators. And we need to make sure they continue to keep doing this great service for, frankly, us. You look at peatlands, they're 3% of the world, and yet they store 30% of the world's carbon. You look at where our drinking water comes from. 55% of Americans get their drinking water from forest land, right? From rivers or streams that flow through forests. And forests do the beautiful job of delivering clean water to us. And so there's this great opportunity to not only protect those things, but also fix those places where we frankly have messed up, where humans have not done such a great job we have the ability to right some historic wrongs on the landscape and get us back to a place where, for lack of a better way to say it, we cut our piece with how we live on this planet. I love designated wilderness. Walked across it for my honeymoon, go into it every year with a backpack on. And wilderness also makes me deeply sad because wilderness is an acknowledgement. In 1964, we acknowledged, hey, we're not very good at living on this planet, so we better draw some circles on some maps and say we're going to protect those places because we don't trust humans, right? Fundamentally, that's what that is, and it's deeply sad. We need to get to a place where we don't have to draw lines on maps anymore, where we figure out how to live sustainably. And until we get to that place, we need to do a bunch of land protection, right? Land protection, land restoration.
And I think this gets to a couple of the questions that I'm seeing coming in right now regarding the definitions of what counts as protected. And there's a technical land management nerd answer, which comes down to something called a gap status code. And for those of you who know what that is, we're talking about gap status codes 1 and 2. Gap status code 1 is more or less wilderness, permanent protection from conversion of land cover. Gap status 2 is an area that has permanent protection, but may also have other uses. In practice, in America, that would mean places like national parks. There are development in national parks. There are roads, there are visitor center, but it is still protected broadly. National monuments, for example, in America are protected, but there are still national monuments that have grazing on them. So it is a patchwork. And as far as private land goes, you are generally talking about conservation easements, where there is a legally binding promise made by the landowner to protect this land in perpetuity and to not develop on it. So the shortcut to what counts as protected, no future development and no extraction from those lands would count as protected for purposes of counting to 30 by 30 and then 50%. And I'm happy to let anyone else in here with more advanced degrees than I do chime in with even more detail here.
And I'm happy to take it right back to a much higher level approach, and to caution that we not get caught up in the math. What 30 by 30 is asking us to do is to think boldly and big about the level of ambition and the level of work we need to do to not have wildlife populations crash, to not have ecosystem function crash, to not deeply impact future generations. And so it's, for the real non-nerd version is, going big and ensuring that that lands have the ability to serve wildlife, to provide ecosystem function. The open space that rings this community that I live in falls into that category, right? It is great. It's intact habitat. And getting back to that collaborative sense, Missoulians figured out a couple decades ago, oh, we need to do something. And so they decided to tax themselves, do an open space bond. It worked so well that 10 years later, they said, oh gosh, we need to replenish that pot. And so it worked again so well that just 2 years ago, we decided to do it again. Understanding that we have an obligation to take care of these lands that sustain us economically and otherwise.
Thanks so much. And, I'd love to stick with Tracy and Aaron, and again, inviting Beau and Katie if you've got other thoughts, but I'd love to turn to policymaking today. And obviously we have this incredible moment of success and an invitation to be visionary, as you've put it, Tracy. And I wanted to speak a little bit more directly about how you envision these current changes and what types of changes they might be able to what we might be able to expect. Because I think typically we think of conservation as receiving a lot of pushbacks. And that's something we're hearing with this moratorium on drilling on public lands. And so in that political space where there is considerable pushback, how do new key players like the new Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and DOI Secretary Deb Haaland at different levels of governance contribute to the conservation movement and help shift that tone?
Aaron, you want to go first?
Sure. In terms of the role that Secretary Granholm and Secretary Haaland will play, I mean, they're the ones steering this ship. They're the ones who are about to inherit large, lumbering bureaucracies and are going to ask tens of thousands of people to move very quickly to make this happen on the president's order. So they are the two where, in terms of federal policy, they're where the rubber meets the road. And we are seeing, obviously, the industry push back to what is not even a moratorium. It is truly just a temporary pause in oil and gas leasing, not even oil and gas drilling. So yes, you are going to see a whole lot more folks screaming that the sky is falling when it's not, at least not for this reason. The sky may be falling for the oil and gas industry because they're mired in debt and have a permanently unsustainable business model, but that has nothing to do with leasing on national public lands. So the trick for them, for these secretaries, is going to be having the right people in place, having their team in place to say, okay, here's how we're going to analyze and attack this problem in a way that is consistent with our bedrock conservation laws. Congress will have a role to play, but even if Congress is completely stymied, because obviously that may be the case with the Senate for a while, you have tools in the federal toolbox. You have NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. You have the Endangered Species Act, which has been eviscerated by the Trump administration, but the law is still on the books. You have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It's going to be taking those tools, those frameworks that previous Congresses wisely gave the Interior Secretary today to say, okay, here's how we are actually going to apply these laws in a way that get us to a much more long-standing protected state for America's lands.
Yeah, I think it's about the leadership is about how you get to yes, right? Instead of saying no. Or as Vice President Harris so delightfully said last week, I eat no for breakfast. And I thought, good, because we need to get to yes. That these bold visions about ensuring that we pass forward all of our shared love of land and water and wildlife, and make no mistake about it, there is unity around protecting wildlife. There is unity around protecting our cherished landscapes. The loud minority is just that. They are the minority. There is overwhelming support in America for the very things that we are talking about today, because there's this basic understanding about our obligation to future generations. And there's, I think, a basic and growing understanding about how we actually really do need to take steps today, or we're in big trouble. And so leaders now are about how do we get to yes in taking those steps. We are going to make mistakes. We are humans, we are fallible. We are going to make mistakes as we forge ahead and try to fix the mistakes of the past. We just have to acknowledge them and move on. And I think that actually the last Congress also showed us about the bipartisan support for some of these issues. The last couple of years were brutal in this country, and we watched it play out on our TV screens. Except the United States Senate and the House of Representatives came together in overwhelming numbers to pass the Great American Outdoors Act, because people care about wildlife, they care about our parks, they care about taking care of and maintaining our parks. There was not big fights about getting it done. In fact, there were people running to the front of the line saying, I'm the one who did it. I'm the one who did it. That gives me great hope that we can put aside the people who will really just complain because they're afraid. They're afraid of change. Because I think we have this great, incredible base of support in the American people. And we now have an incredible base of support from the president pulling us along.
Thank you so much. Those, I think, beautifully put. And now I'd like to turn to some of our questions from the audience. And we'd actually had a similar question planned for all of our panelists to be able to speak to, but I'll read this one from Cara Beth Thuringer. A number of other social scientists have critiqued the Global 30 by 2030 proposal on a number of points, namely that the proposal places the burden of conservation on BIPOC communities in the global south and makes these communities less resilient to climate change and more vulnerable to economic shocks due to the unreliability of ecotourism, and I assume other sort of capitalist approaches. I was wondering if the panelists would respond to some of these critiques, and I'd particularly like to attach a bit of our question. How do your campaigns work to strengthen these relationships as well as protections for these lands and people?
I'm happy to take the first stab here. There are 1.6 billion people around the planet who depend directly on wild areas for their livelihoods. And if we don't succeed at protecting half, which again, the reason we need to protect half is because that's the level of protection needed to ensure ecosystem services and climate stabilization and basically life on Earth as we know it, then those 1.6 billion people are the ones who will be and who today are the first to suffer. And they're the communities that we're speaking to in this question. Thank you for the question that was posed. It's the most vulnerable communities who are experiencing these tragedies around the world that are the result of our destructive relationship with nature. It's Black people in inner cities, it's Latino families in rural communities, and people in countries who do not have the political or economic power to change the future for themselves. Nature should benefit all. Conservation needs to be for everyone. And protection of half and expanding that natural area protection to encompass half of our Earth secures accessibility for these life-giving benefits for all people. At Wild, we've been, our foundation story or origin story, I encourage people to visit our website, has been one of following indigenous leadership, because indigenous communities have recognized long before modern science the importance of reciprocity with the earth. And the work of Nature Needs Half is about bringing respect and dignity to all life in all corners of the earth. Environmental justice is central to that mission.
Happy to follow up on that too, Katie, and appreciate you kicking us off on that. I mean, I think the reality of this world we're living in is really kind of why we need to ensure that equity is centered and driving this work forward. I mean, I just think about the last year that we've had as a world, right? As a human society, of like facing a global public health pandemic. We've had incredible economic downturn. We've seen the movement to dismantle systemic racism grow internationally, right? And now we're talking about 30 by 30 and Nature Needs Half because we're experiencing a nature crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis. And all these things are connected, right? And if we're not acting towards all of them, especially with that eye towards equity, I think we end up failing at all of them at the end of the day. All these things are inextricably tied to racism. So in Colorado, we know that communities of color are 20% likelier to experience nature deprivation. But part of the problem is also, right, is it's not as simple as just creating new green space and parks in those communities without access to nature, without abundant nature, because if people of color don't feel safe going to those parks because of historical relations with police brutality, then we haven't actually solved for this problem, right? I guess just to kind of round this out, right, is that the benefits of these campaigns for the world, for the country, for Colorado, for the Western US, they span all these issues we're talking about: the economy, climate, wildlife, food and water supply, clean air, right, and so on. We have to be really intentional on how we embark on these goals, and that's going to necessitate building relationships and engaging with racially diverse communities towards these goals. Really, any policy goals that we have.
I'd just like to jump in and say that in terms of the global concerns, which are very real and valid concerns, especially when you look at some nations around the world where, particularly, for example, Brazil, where deforestation is drastically impacting and harming indigenous people there. The opportunity that the United States has right now is to set an example for the world. And what gives me a whole lot of hope is the fact that this executive order that President Biden signed today is centered, everything in it is centered around environmental justice and climate justice. And not just to say that, but to actually create offices in the White House, in Health and Human Services, in the Justice Department dedicated to environmental justice, and to make sure that the funding goes to marginalized communities first. And on top of that, the fact that we are going to have America's first ever Indigenous Interior Secretary, long overdue to have an Indigenous person overseeing America's public lands, is really remarkable. And I hope, will set a model for the rest of the world as we get to 30% and then 50%. This is how you do it, not just ensuring environmental justice, but raising all of those communities up so that they are central to this effort and not on the sides of it.
I don't even think I can add to this, to what was said by the last three folks, because they so nailed it. It comes back to that, we need all of the things. Equity has to be a part of it. We are Homo sapiens, we are animals, we are part of nature. Every single one of us across the 6 billion plus, I've actually lost count, we're over 7 now, aren't we? Anyway, across the planet relies on being a part of nature, literally to live. And there have been grotesque inequities that we need to fix. And the thing that, getting to what Aaron just said, the thing that is so exciting is this administration is imbuing climate work and environmental work into all of the things they do, recognizing that we are a part of nature and we have this obligation and this drastic need to fix how we've not done right by nature. It's really encouraging. I mean, I remember, I'm showing my age now, but 20-some years ago, 25 years ago, I said, wouldn't it be nice if people stopped talking about environmentalists, conservationists, and it's just what we do as a society? Like that is what this administration is beginning to get us towards. It's just what we do as a society, because otherwise we really are going to crash.
Thank you for those responses. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to follow up on that question. We had another comment from the question and answer section. Folks wanted to understand what kind of inclusion practices are part of these campaigns. So Nature Needs Half and 30 by 30, how do they ensure that historically excluded and marginalized communities are part of the planning and implementation process?
So on the 30 by 30 initiative, which I should note, we are one group speaking up for the broader goal, and Center for Western Priorities are not the group leading it. I don't know that you can point to any one organization that is 30 by 30 domestically, but you look at it as coalition building is the entire point of it. As Tracy noted, you cannot get there by yourself. You cannot get there just with federal land protections. You cannot get there just with private landowners. So the entire process, if we are going to succeed, means engaging tribal nations from the very beginning. It means engaging communities of color from the beginning to find out where in their communities, because protecting space for nature inside our cities is going to have to be a vital part of this, and making sure that that restoration is happening, because obviously you don't have much wilderness inside American cities, but you do have opportunities for restoration, and making sure that that restoration is happening at the community level with buy-in and with access. So it is, that becomes truly a project by project, state by state process of making sure that everyone is being engaged, because you're never going to get there with just a top-down, someone pointing at a map and saying, protect this, 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 or that. It will never work.
I think
And
go ahead, Katie.
Sorry, I'll just jump in briefly to say that's true for Nature Needs Half as well. I'm not looking to make decisions for what areas get protected. I'm looking to build coalitions that are representative of these communities, to make decisions about places that need protection on the most critical landscapes, first and foremost, that aren't looking to exclude people from those landscapes, but are looking to exclude the most detrimental practices. But it's really about coalition building and bringing all different kinds of leadership into those coalitions to make decisions for people themselves that are of places in their own backyard. Tracy and Beau have things to add, I know, as well.
Yeah, I was heartened by, we're still waiting for the executive order itself, but I was heartened by how the White House is talking about it and how the Interior Department is talking about it. They're saying that they are gonna undertake a process with broad engagement, and including forest landowners, fishermen, outdoor enthusiasts, sovereign tribal nations, states, territories, local communities, and others, getting back to all of the things, that it has to come from the ground for it to be durable, and for it to be lasting. And it has to come from the ground because people who live in places know their places. They understand them. And if we don't use that wisdom from people and their communities, we'll fail.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just wrap up on this question with a few thoughts. I think one is, Kenny alluded to this earlier, the importance of language. That's something we can control, is how we talk about things and how we welcome conversations. Relationship building, coalition building, these are things that take a long time to build that trust and to build that respect to effectively accomplish goals and get work done, essentially. So I guess I put a big emphasis on patience in the process, right? Like we want to move fast. We want to see areas conserved for nature and for wildlife and for people, but recognize that part of doing it right means maybe going a little bit slower and taking time to build those relationships with people.
I learned a really valuable lesson working in some ranching country where people talk about the 80-20 rule, where there's 80% that we agree on, and that's really probably what we should focus on, not the 20. And that's, I think, the spirit that this campaign needs to bring forward. Find those places, find that 80%, and go do that work. And in doing that work, we'll learn a lot more about each other so we can solve the 20%.
Thanks for these comments. And obviously this is a topic it's deserves its own more than an hour-long panel. So I'd like to pivot now to some other questions from our audience, and I appreciate those responses. So I'd like to combine a couple of questions. One is from Brees Roberts. Can you tell us more about efforts to track, measure, and monitor the impacts of what we are protecting, whether public or private? How will we know we are protecting the right places? I know you've added some comments to this nature in the chat as well, our panelists, so thanks for doing that. But another question from Nancy Steele, where are we today in terms of percent protected thus far? So a bit more of a, let's hear some of the nuts and bolts and numbers on some of these campaigns.
All right, so I just looked up the most recent numbers. I've got in the US, 12% of the land in the US and 26% of the oceans are protected. So in terms of the ocean goal, American US oceans actually pretty darn close to 30% in terms of counting those gap status, and a long ways to go in terms of land protection. Globally, there is actually a wonderful website called protectedplanet.net that is doing this, inventorying all of the protected areas across the globe. 15.3% of land protected, and only 7.6% of oceans. I am not an ocean scientist and don't do a lot of work on oceans, since we focus on landlocked states in the Mountain West. But I do know from my conversations with Dr. Enrique Sala, who is an ocean scientist and leading on this effort, there are huge concerns among the ocean conservation community regarding how quickly we have to move in a number of places, and that stuff is hard. That is where, as far as the Biden administration goes, that's where John Kerry is going to play a role in getting countries to a place where we can all agree that we are protecting 30% and then 50% of the world's oceans in order to protect that marine biodiversity.
And I just want to bring two resources to the attention of participants in case it's of interest. The first is the Center for American Progress did a big project called the Disappearing West, and they did a great job tracking the loss of wildlands and rivers in the Western US. So that'd be one place to look and kind of track progress. And then the other is the Global Safety Net Study. And they have an amazing website that is this global study of all these different layers of protection and also areas of critical endangerment for species and biodiversity to help prioritize areas for protection. So they have a really awesome interactive website, and I think that's a tool that can be really helpful in making decisions about how we go about this work.
Thank you. I think that's really, that about covers it. And so I wanted to just pivot. We've got only 2 minutes left, but I'd love to hear from each of you briefly about, this is a question from Caden Daniel Ashdown. And this person wants to know, what practical actions can everyday citizens take to contribute to this push for conservation? And I'd love to hear just one short thought from each of you.
I'll start. Caden, I would say, as much as you can, tell your story, a story that's specific to you and why this matters, and let that story be told to you, your community, your family, those within your sphere of influence. You can amplify that message through Nature Needs Half by becoming an ambassador on our website, but just being a storyteller of why this is important. And if we can all do that, that's one amazing way to light a wildfire of this movement.
I will just add, speak up to your elected officials, call your members of Congress, call your mayors, your county commissioners, let them know that this is important to you. I live in Jefferson County, just outside of Denver, where we have an open space department. And what a difference that makes to have a part of the county government that thinks about space in terms of not just parks or recreation, but openness. And the importance of that is what makes living here in the foothills of the Rockies so marvelous. If you convince your local elected officials to apply that model locally and tell your members of Congress that this is going to take all of us quickly, and you want them to sign on to congressional action to protect much more land very quickly in America.
So let's briefly hear from Beau and then Tracy.
Great. Yeah, I would say everything Katie and Aaron said, and get out there and organize. Go talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors. Make sure that they know about these campaigns, why we need to move so quickly, and organize. We're all organizers, right?
All of those things. And make sure that you go outside and take care of yourself. And bring somebody who has never been. I didn't sleep outside until I was 18 years old, and it changed my life. Like, you literally can change somebody's life by simply taking them outside.
Thank you so much. I wish we could keep going, but that is all the time we have today. And I just think that's a beautiful way to end it. I think, the change starts with each one of us. And I know that all of you experts will be out there working on these issues in your work professionally. And I know that you'll remain guiding lights for this work and for those of us that have questions. So we just wanted to thank our expert panelists one more time for your time today and unwavering commitment to conserving nature. This was the final seminar in our series, and we invite you to visit our website, conservationpolicydiscussions.org, to view recordings of previous seminars on water, fire, and land protection in the West. And we encourage you to share this series with your friends, colleagues, and elected officials. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a chance to get outside and enjoy some of that nature. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.